Hello everybody, and welcome to Berggarten Markets Wine Cache number 5, Roads Less Traveled. So, as usual for the Wine Cache Wine Club, I had a lot of fun picking out these wines. And this one in particular, offered a lot of great eye-opening experiences for me personally, because they're also wines from areas that I haven't explored that much. And that's the fun thing. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about roads less traveled. We're talking about regions that are making really incredible wines, but are not as well known here in the United States. And in particular, we're going to be talking about Greece, Croatia, and Slovenia. One of the things that these three regions have in common is that, as I said, winemaking has been going on in these regions for thousands of years, and Greece is possibly the oldest or one of the oldest winemaking regions in the world. They're making wine as far back as 3000 BC. And while these regions were known in ancient times for producing great wines, all three regions have also been or gone through some great tumult, some great upheaval, which kind of really badly damaged their reputation as winemakers and kind of destroyed the wine trade in all of these regions and countries. And we'll get more into why that was once we get into the individual wines and the individual regions. But each of these examples of wines and regions or countries had this kind of great early run of winemaking, and were known in the ancient times and even through, to a certain extent, the Middle Ages for producing great wines, and then kind of really fell off, all of them, until the 20th century. And for a few of them, we're talking about pretty recently, the early 1990s, where some of these regions started to have, or were able now, had the capabilities to develop their wines once again. So each of these areas are going through kind of a renaissance period of wine, and so just really fun to explore. So that's kind of the end of our little introduction. Let's get into the various wine regions and talk about the regions and the wines we're going to be trying. So the first country or region we're going to get into is Greece. So Greece is one of the oldest producing wine countries in the world, historically speaking. They've been producing wine since, around, well, probably even further back than 2000 BCE. So there were other cultures producing wine back then as well, in particular Mesopotamia and Egypt, but wine was not nearly as important to those cultures. Mesopotamia and Egypt were also producing beer at that time, and so for kind of everyday drinking, the Egyptians drank, according to archaeological evidence, it seems a lot more beer than wine. Wine was for special occasions, for special celebrations. It wasn't something that everyone could afford. And unlike Egypt and Macedonia, wine and the culture of wine pervaded almost all parts of the culture of Greece. So wine was used for everyday drinking in Greece. Wine was a lot safer typically than water. So almost every Greek drank wine on a daily basis. Now, they weren't going around stumbling around the streets drunk. The Romans did the same thing in terms of drinking wine instead of water. That's not entirely true. A lot of times it would be a combination of water and wine. So the Greeks would add water to their wine as part of their everyday drinking experience. So by most estimates, the wine they're drinking after it's watered down is maybe 3% alcohol. So kind of relatively very low. So wine is important because it's used in their everyday drinking life, and the alcohol in wine will kill a lot of the dangerous bacteria and stuff that you would find in cities like Athens. We're talking about the ancient world here, so like sanitation and hygiene was not nearly as good as it is today. Wine was also pervasive in their religion. Everything from not only drinking it during celebrations, but also used as sacrifice. So in a lot of religious ceremonies, there would be sacrifices to the gods, and a lot of times these sacrifices involved not only animals, but food, and certainly wine, especially when a lot of those ceremonies were linked, or those celebrations were linked to Dionysus. So even there's a famous Greek god that centers around the idea of drinking and wine in Dionysus. The Greeks did a lot of different things with wine in terms of they would often add seawater or brine to the wine to help extend the age of the wine. Some of it was used as flavoring, but for the most part was to make the wine last a little longer. It was one of the first, if not the first culture to add different things to wine, like honey or herbs. So I think it's like the first type of vermouth probably came from Greece as well. Certainly wine was pervasive in their literature as well. So even in their oral tradition, the stories of Homer were passed down orally for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and wine was always a prevalent part of what the characters in those stories drank. Probably the most important contribution Greece played to the Western world in terms of their contribution to the popularity of wine and the growth of wine in various other cultures was their colonization. The Greeks were not the conquerors that like the Romans were, for example, but they did colonize a lot of the Mediterranean. And along with this colonization throughout Sicily and other parts of Italy, throughout the Balkans, what back then was called Illyria, and even through Spain and France, there were Greek colonies, excuse me, third time's always a charm with that one. Greek colonies brought vines with them. And so you had these cultures kind of starting their own grape growing tradition, winemaking tradition, because of the colonization by the Greeks of these different areas. So again, the influence the Greeks had it can't be overestimated, historically speaking. Now, as time went on, unfortunately, the Greeks lost their distinction as this fantastic wine-producing region. And that kind of started in the late 15th century with the conquering of most of Greece by the Ottoman Empire. And then that lasted through the mid 20th century, actually probably even further back. While they still made wine during the Ottoman Empire, when they were part of the Ottoman Empire used wine production as a great way to tax its citizens and make money, and restricted trade. So the Greek wine trade disappeared essentially after the conquest by the Ottoman Empire. And then after that, you had World War I, World War II, Greece faced devastation in both, and then there was a civil war. And then even after the Civil War, Greece and the Greek economy to this day struggles quite a bit. And sadly, I'm trying to think the best way to put this, still great wine was made in Greece during these times, but when you're talking about France, for example, who can kind of, during that time, market and freely trade and establish this kind of aristocratic land-owning class of individuals, they had not only the marketing, but the money to expand their lands, expand their vineyards, export, import, trade. And Greece, because of the conquering by the Ottoman Empire, then World War I, World War II, and the Civil War after World War II, never had that kind of landed class of wealth that could afford to successfully market and then export their wines in a way and on a level that other parts of the world could. That's changed over the last 30, 20, 10, 5 years, even although Greece still struggles in some parts economically, of course, if anyone pays attention to the news over the last 5 to 10 years. But slowly that does begin to change. Slowly Greece does replant a lot of its vineyards and begins to slowly export and create trade for their wine. But it's been a very slow process. And even today, about 95% of the wine that's made in Greece is drunk only in Greece. And for the rest of us, we are missing out. There's fantastic wines that are made in Greece that you can get in Europe, but slowly there have been more and more great wines coming into the US and coming into other parts of the world. But like a lot of other areas in this region, that's been kind of, unfortunately, gone through a lot of civil and economic troubles over the years. We are only seeing it very slowly. So I'm not going to end on a sad note. That has all changed to a good extent. Greece has gone through a wine renaissance over the last 20, 30 years, and we are starting to see more really cool wines come out of that country and come into the US, and we're going to go into one of them right now. So enough of some of the depressing stuff. Greece now is a very exciting wine region. There has been a lot of reinvestment in vineyards and in winemaking. As I said earlier, 90 to 95% of the wine is still produced in Greece, is still drunk in Greece. But there's a lot of exciting stuff coming out of Greece as well. And the quality of winemaking is really elevated. And you understand why historically Greece has always been so important to the history of wine culture and winemaking. And I was very lucky we were very lucky about 3 months ago or so. Here in Iowa, there's been a really cool book, a really cool importer that's brought in some really fantastic stuff from Greece. So really excited. And not Retsina, a lot of people are familiar with Retsina, which has its own place, and I like Retsina. That's kind of the pine wine. A lot of people know Retsina when it comes to Greece, and that's about it. Some of the stuff that we've gotten in recently is super high quality red and whites at different price point, anywhere from $10 to about $40. So the wine we're gonna do today is made with a grape called Zinno Mavro. Zinno Mavro is an important grape throughout certain parts of Greece. The wine producer is, I'm gonna butcher this so bad, is Thermopolis or Thermopolis. We're gonna say Thermopolis. And it's actually from a fairly well-known region in Greece. You actually see Naousa. Naousa is, I would say, probably most quality wines you see in Greece right now come from Naousa. Naousa is in the very northern part of Greece. You know, Macedonia, part of Macedonia broke off from Greece. There's the Republic of Macedonia, and then a little further south, you hit Naousa. And so Naousa is home to a fair amount of, I guess, what you would call native varietals. It's also home to things like Zinno Mavro. They do grow some Cab and Merlot in that area as well. Greece is a little unlike Italy and France because it's taken some time to kind of, the wine industry to kind of regrow itself and rebirth itself. You don't get every nook and corner of Greece making wine, also partially because of its geography. But the areas like Naousa, like Rapsani, we have a great wine as well from Rupsani. Rupsani is really kind of an up-and-coming area as well. But there is wine in the northern Italy, or northern Greece, excuse me, central Greece, down in the Peloponnesian Islands. So there are kind of wine regions that kind of are really taking off in various parts of Greece. But there's still a lot of growth that you'll be seeing, I would imagine, in the next 15 to 20 years. So this is Young Vines. It says Zino Mavro. So Zino Mavro, I've been lucky enough to have a few now. The style of Zino Mavro ranges from kind of light to medium bodied to very full bodied. Some of them can be kind of a little tannic and harsh at first, especially when they're young. Some of them could be a little softer and elegant. So it really depends upon the climate, where the grape is grown, and also the winemaking, what they're doing to the wine. Are they aging it in oak? A lot of Greek winemakers are using oak now. Or is it in newer oak? Is it in older wood? Or are they doing it in cement tanks? A lot of that determines what the wine will be like. They all seem to have, to my taste, an underlying current of minerality to them, which I love. Some of them could get really almost like iron and like meaty and bloody, which I like as well, but not necessarily for everyone. I picked this particular producer because it's a really beautiful introduction to Zino Mavro, and it has that minerality to it, but it's very well balanced. It's not overpowering. You won't get like bloody meat and iron. And you can tell by the color, it's definitely a lighter style. It is younger vines. But unlike a lot of wines, when they have younger vines in the label, I'm always expecting it to be kind of light and lacking a little something. But this does not. So a lot of great light red berry on the nose. It is light, but good fruit. There is spice there. There is some of that minerality. It has nice acidity to it. This is something I would happily sip on my porch, but it would be a great food wine as well. And what kind of food? Think about a lot of Mediterranean things or Mediterranean-based foods. Anything kind of based in a tomato sauce, whether it be a vegetable dish, a pasta dish, or even a lighter meat dish. This would be excellent with pizza. If you're thinking like more Italian-American fare, this would be wonderful with. But smells, it's lovely. And almost a little violet and anise on the nose that also translates into the palate. So really a delicious wine, and fairly affordable. This runs about $16 or $17 on the shelf, and has become a new favorite of mine. It's actually in my favorite sections right now. So I hope you enjoyed as much as I do, and I encourage you to explore and try more Greek wines. You will not be disappointed. Next, we're going to be talking about, again, all these regions, and this one is no exception, have a deep history steeped in winemaking. And we're going to be talking about, in particular, the region now known as Croatia. So Croatia, as well as just like the Greeks, I should say, have been making wine for thousands of years. That date back to, again, we're talking almost 2,000 years. Back then, of course, the area was kind of settled and controlled by an ancient peoples called the Illyrians. And the Illyrians are kind of what we would now call like a Baltic coast area, kind of right across the Adriatic and up north from Italy. And the Illyrians became very proficient at winemaking and eventually were influenced by the Greeks, who started to colonize parts of Illyria, and then eventually the Romans, who conquered Illyria. Of course, the Illyrians are, even if you haven't heard of the Illyrians before, you have heard of Illyrians. Some of the greatest emperors in Roman history were Illyrian, especially the later Roman Empire. So like Aurelian, Diocletian, Constantine, They were not Roman, or they were Roman in the sense that they were part of the Roman Empire, but they were not from the city of Rome. They were actually from Illyria. But that, now I'm doing a whole different podcast. So Croatia has a long history and winemaking culture as well. Much like the Greeks and the country we're going to talk about next, Slovenia, that region has also gone through, historically speaking, quite a bit of turmoil that kind of certainly put wine and the winemaking industry of Croatia kind of way in the background. Like the Greeks, the area that we know as Croatia now was also conquered by the Ottomans around the same time period as the Greeks were. They eventually become part of like the Habsburg dynasty. And then you have World War I, World War II. Essentially, they are then part of Yugoslavia. I don't think we need to kind of rehash what happened with Yugoslavia, but obviously civil war, war for independence. So Croatia eventually becomes its own nation in, I think, the early 90s, 91, 92, after the civil war, after the fracture of Yugoslavia. And again, slowly begins to reinvest in winemaking, food, culture of the region, and tourism. Croatia has just blown up insanely, not only as a fine wine producing area, but also as a tourist area. I think it's been, in Europe especially, one of the hottest tourist destinations of the last 15, 20 years. And by all accounts, they have amazing food. I've tasted a number of amazing wines from Croatia. And just, it's, you know, made up, it's an area that's made up of a number of islands. So beautiful, kind of on the water. So one day maybe we can start to travel again, I think soon. And Croatia is very high on my list. But it's the wine for me, just because that's what I've been exposed to the last 4 or 5 years that has really stood out. There's a very famous Italian restaurant in Chicago that I went to a number of years ago. They had one season of their tasting menu, food and wine tasting menu. They kind of went away from Italian wines and did all Croatian wines, and they were absolutely delicious. So despite the kind of bumpy history, to put it mildly, Croatia has done a lot to kind of create this renaissance of winemaking. And the wine we have today is Kozlovic. It's made from a varietal called Teran, and it's actually from a region called Istria. Istria, which is kind of unusual. Istria actually makes some incredible white wines from a grape that I think is essentially Malvasia. I think they pronounce it, or they have a slightly different name in Croatia for it. But Istria is more known for its whites than reds, but there are small pockets of that region that make red wine as well. Croatia is probably, its most well-known region is Dalmatia, or Dalmatia is how you pronounce it. I'm going to say yes on that. And a lot of times on labels, you'll see that region, and they produce some incredible, that region of Dalmatia produces the kind of richest and fullest body reds that I've tasted out of Croatia. They can get kind of high in alcohol. Comparatively, it's not stuff we don't see here in the US, but like 14, 15%. So almost kind of on like in the warmer regions of California, like Lodi, you'll get some Zins that are that high. But both of these regions are kind of high quality producing regions in Croatia. So Teran is the varietal. And I actually had this wine recently. So it kind of smells like a Zin a little bit, like a lighter, not quite as intense and ripe, but it has this kind of like ripe berry pie, not sweet at all, but a really lovely nose. Yeah, and tastes just like it did the last time I had it. Really beautiful little wine. It's kind of has, it's almost like a restrained Zinfandel, if you want to compare it to something. It's uniquely its own wine. I would not say this is like a clone of Zin or tastes like Zin or anything like that. It's just kind of what it reminds me of a little bit. It has kind of the right berry up front, but then restrains itself. It doesn't go too far. It's not over the top. It's just really lovely fruit, a little brambly spice to it, but is balanced with a little bit of nice acidity, but not acidic at all. I would say that's kind of on the low medium side, but there's enough there to kind of balance it out. Just a fun fact about Croatia, we were talking about how long they've been making wine in that region. There's I guess it's a plain. There's kind of a land area on an island called Hvar, called Stari Grad, and that it's literally, Stari Grad is the oldest continuous viticulture area in the world. So they've had vines there since they think at least the 4th century BCE. So, as we talked about how old an ancient Greek wine culture is, in other places like Mesopotamia and Egypt, Croatia is home to the oldest continuous used vineyard in the world. So again, steeped in culture, it's no wonder that Croatia is really starting to make, or has been making for the last 10 years now, a comeback in terms of producing great wine. And Croatia is one of those areas where you're just going to see more and more of its wine coming into the U.S. Because it's just blowing up right now. But for now, we have the wonderful Kozlovic, and enjoy. Last but not least, for our final wine, we are going to Slovenia. So we're very much in the same general region we have been for the first two wines, especially near and around Croatia as well. So we're still talking about the Balkans. We're still talking about a region that has history steeped deep in wine culture. So just like I talked about the Illyrians with Croatia in terms of ancient history and the peoples that first settled there, the Illyrians were also prevalent in the area we now call Slovenia. So we're talking about a region that has been producing wine for thousands of years, almost as long as the Greeks, if not as early. And then a wine kind of culture and history that kind of continued to flourish throughout colonization of some Greek city-states, as well as through the Roman conquest, and up through the Middle Ages, certainly, where you had actually a great deal of Christian influence. So you had monasteries that continued this winemaking tradition in this area. And then it kind of follows a path somewhat similar to Croatia in that the region eventually becomes part of the Austria-Hungarian Empire through World War I, and then after World War II becomes part of what was known as Yugoslavia. And then, of course, you had the breakup and Civil War, and eventually Slovenia becomes its own independent. There's an independent nation that results of this, or there are a number of independent nations that become existent after the conflict in Yugoslavia and the breakup of Yugoslavia, and one of them is Slovenia. Slovenia, of all those areas that were part of the former Yugoslavian area, Slovenia was kind of the first country in that region to reestablish its wine industry, I guess you would call it. They were the first to create laws that kind of resulted in kind of strict control of quality in Slovenia, and they began to produce and export wine quicker than its neighbors for a number of reasons. And you could tell with the results. Croatian wines that I've tasted have been great and too outstanding. Some of the Slovenian wines I've tasted are just killer. I mean, we've had at Bread Garden for the last couple of years a really fantastic, or a couple of fantastic rosés that have come out of Slovenia. And just recently we've gotten to taste some reds as well. And this next one, I'm really excited. So Slovenia really kind of jumped on the train like Croatia, but even quicker in terms of reestablishing its culture for food and wine. And even though they still export only a small amount, probably total production-wise, Slovenia is still only exporting about 10 to 15% of their wines. But where they're exporting to is Croatia, the Czech Republic, Bosnia, and the U.S. So the top 4 exports. So you'll have some luck, especially over the next few years, finding more Slovenian wines in the U.S. And it is lucky because they are wonderful. So our last wine, this is Gonk 6. Gonk is actually the same producer that produces some of those fabulous rosés that we've been carrying over the last couple of years. And it's just a fantastic winery. It's run by Peter Jean or Peter Jean. I'm not sure how to pronounce the last name. And they're really doing killer stuff. This is their Blaufränkisch. Blaufränkisch in parts of like Austria and Germany is known as Lemberger, so same grape essentially. And what's really cool about this wine is that Peter Jean is doing something really unique. He wanted to make something that was different. You know, you can find Blaufränkisch in restaurants and retail stores. It's not the most common grape in the world, certainly, but you can usually find at a good wine shop 1, 2, even 3 examples of Blaufränkisch or Lemberger from various parts of the world. But the cool thing that he did, and I love this wine. I don't know how much a role this type of winemaking techniques plays in it, but he actually freezes the wine, or partially freezes. He freezes some of the wine, or some of the juice, I should say, and he just takes partially thawed juice, ferments, and adds that into the wine or as part of the wine. I'm guessing it's not 100% done that way. I'm guessing it's a percentage of wine that is made from the thawed juice. I could be wrong, but I think the wine would be a lot more expensive if the entire wine was made like that. But essentially, so it's not an ice wine, it's not a dessert wine, it's not sweet at all. But essentially what he's doing is kind of artificially concentrating the grape, because by freezing the juice and then just taking some of the early thawed parts, juice out of that frozen block, you're leaving a lot of water behind. So what you get is kind of a much more concentrated wine. And that's what he has here. So it's weird. It's kind of, I've never heard of anyone doing that type of thing. I know, like with certain types of producers in like warmer areas like California, when they try to reproduce or make ice wine, they flash freeze the grapes, but they're making sweet wine, and that's not what he's doing here. And then in Amarone, they're doing a pasito method where they're kind of dehydrating the grapes by hanging them in the sun or putting them out on mats in the sun. But this is kind of wholly unique. I have not heard. I'm sure there are other people who may have done this in the past, but I don't know who they are. And you can smell that it's a really intense nose and beautiful. And it's so unique. It's got really nice fruit, really nice spice. No tannins there, but soft, a little minerally. But it has an intensity that a lot of Blaufränkischs I have do not have. It's not thin, it's not acidic. But it's not overly ripe either. It's delicious. I really enjoy all of these wines. That might be my favorite of the bunch, as much as I love the Koslovic Tiran and as much as I really enjoy that Sina Mavro from Greece. This little Gonk 6 Blaufränkisch is delicious. And they've been around since like 1936, so it's not a super old winery. Again, it's a winery that kind of, I think, made its bones, when it was a part of Yugoslavia. Of course, there were wines in Yugoslavia, but it was mostly co-op stuff. So you would co-op all the grapes and juice. You're essentially talking about a communist regime. I don't think it's even essentially. So everything is shared, which on its surface may not seem like, oh, sharing, but individuality in terms of you're making wine for the state, essentially. So you're doing a giant production facilities for making cheap mass-produced wines for the state and for sale in the state. And so they've been around since that time, and then kind of really have started to make, as Slovenia became its own autonomous state, really started to kind of differentiate themselves and start to make kind of their own individual wines that has become Gonk style. So it's delicious. Please enjoy, take your time with these wines, enjoy them. These are regions that you should be looking for places where you can find really cool, fantastic wines for decent prices. I mean, this Blaufränkisch is probably, I think it's in the mid-20s, $26, $27 a bottle. But I think if this Blaufränkisch were made in certain regions of the Côte d'Aron in France, or in Bordeaux, or certain parts of Tuscany, you'd be paying $15, $20, $30 more just because it comes from these famous regions. So Greece, Croatia, Slovenia, all regions you should be paying attention to as we get more and more of them in the US, because they are making some incredible, incredible wines. I hope you have enjoyed tasting them as much as I have, and we'll see you next time.